Good evening once again, our friends, and welcome once again to the Leo and Larry show. And I'm here as usual with my partner and co-host, Larry Smith. I'm Leo Whitberry, and you're
I'm Larry Smith, publisher of the Community Times Newspaper.
thank you. We have a special guest this evening, all the way from London, England. And she was with us during our recent visit to London, and we talked about many of the connections between situations here in the U.S. and also in London. And she's none other than Mary Dickinson, a member of the Stop Burning Trees Coalition. Glad to have you, Mary.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Welcome.
Mhm. Thank you so much. So why don't you tell our listening audience something about yourself, some of your background, previous work you've done, and how you've come to do the work that you're currently involved in.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I'm Mary Dickinson. I'm a campaigner with the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, Extracts and Biofuel Watch, which I've been doing in this capacity for close to a year now, I think. Yeah, so I have the history of environmental justice campaigning, different organizations campaigning often against fossil fuels, running like divestment campaigns in my university, then moving on to sort of broader widespread campaigning. And then I got very heavily involved with sort of focusing on biomass and DRAX in particular a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, when we set up sort of this iteration of Axe DRAX, which is a grassroots network in Yorkshire, and now has spread much broader than that, sort of with the focus of taking action against DRAX, because well, a couple of us lived about 20 or do live about 20 miles away from DRAX. It's right on our doorstep, and we see this every time we get a train to London, every time we go somewhere. And it just felt, once I started learning more and more about it, that there was this huge injustice that was right on our doorstep and allowed the sort of opportunity for local campaigning, engaging with the local community, but also trying to do something to stop the massive harm that Drax is causing here and abroad. So that sort of went through sort of like we were doing sort of different demos, that sort of thing with Extracts. We've moved now more into direct action. And then I got involved with setting up the Stop Burning Trees Coalition last year for Drax's AGM, which was in April. And it's sort of a grassroots network of lots of different groups around the north, from trade unionists to health campaigners to environmental campaigners, all working together to try and stop this destructive industry, but particularly Drax, because they're the biggest in the world, they're the baddest in the world, and they're constantly growing every day. So trying to do what we can to stop that here and stop the harm that's being caused with our money abroad. And now that takes up
Okay.
pretty much all my time.
Mhm. And so for our audience, Drax is the largest utility in the world that uses biomass wood products, which basically trees are cut down, they grind them up, they turn them into these pellets, and they coal fire them. They burn them along with coal. And what they're telling the world is that because they're using wood, that they're not putting as much pollution in the air. They're not adding to the emissions that scientists say is causing a climate change. And so Yorkshire is in the northern part of England, and that's where they have a huge facility that just burns wood and have this huge giant cooling tower. And the wood that they use is sourced or comes from the southeastern United States of America. And so, but of course, with any facility that is burning things and emitting fumes, the people who live there, like Mary, up to 20 miles away, are experiencing some harms. And so, Mary, can you tell us some more about like what harms, what's happening to the environment on your side of the ocean before we start talking about what's happening in the United States with this company and others?
Yeah, for sure. So to preface it, Drax does export most of their harm, which I think we're going to get into in plenty of depth. But here in the UK, there's still the same issues of the particulate matter that's being emitted, sort of the wood dust being very carcinogenic. So Drax is currently going through a court case at the moment. They've been taken to court by the Health and Safety Executive for having unsafe levels of air pollution for their workers over the last about 10 years, I think. It's been very difficult to get any information out of that. They're keeping it very close, but we do know that they have just been polluting their workers for over a decade. Then in the area, Selby itself, they actually don't measure air pollution, which I mean, anyone could hazard a guess to why that is when every other area does. But we know from local people and from studies that have been done, there is no way that they aren't emitting dangerous levels of pollution to that area. Their current newest project as well, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is what they're pushing at the moment, has been linked to the amines they use to scrub the carbon also have lots of potential carcinogenic impacts, as well as harm to the area around the site where there's lots of protected species and that sort of thing, because it is in quite a rural part of the north of England. But fundamentally, most of the harm that Drax is doing is exported abroad to communities like yours, to communities in Canada, in Estonia, and that's still all being funded by our government. So it's dangerous here, but I think what they're doing is far, far worse abroad.
So you said that a lot of the what's being admitted are carcinogens. So are you seeing an increase both in the residents around Drax and the employees of Drax? Have you guys seen an increase in the number of people who are contracting cancer?
We've seen a couple of people, but I don't think there's been enough research to properly say that. We've spoken to some ex-employees who've developed long-term respiratory health issues, not necessarily cancer, but a lot of former employees or employees do suffer with respiratory health issues. But we haven't got any sort of data necessarily on the area of Selby, because I think part of it is that their smokestacks are so high that it disperses it over quite a wide range of Europe, quite a wide range of England, but also into Europe as well. So it's sort of quite dispersed, the impacts it's having. But we think if they build this new technology, that is likely to change and be even more concentrated in that local area, which is why we're trying to prevent that from happening.
Mhm. And so as you said that most of the harm that they do is exported to the South, and this is the Southeast, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama are the primary states where they're logging, and those trees that are logged are being turned into pellets in places like Northampton, North Carolina, Dobbins Heights, North Carolina. We have some smaller pellet facilities in Greenwood, South Carolina, and one is being built right now as I speak in Florence County, where Larry and I reside. And then they also have some in Lucedale, Mississippi, and some other place, Adel, Georgia, and they just were fined $2.5 million by our Environmental Protection Agency for emitting more pollutants in Gloucester, Mississippi, than they reported to the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. So while you're having environmental and health issues in Mississippi, we're seeing the same thing in the United States, where they're producing the pellets that are being burnt by Drax in the United Kingdom. So Larry, you see the connection with this, that pretty much, and I said this while I was in London, this is so similar to what was happening in slavery days, when again, a lot of the cotton and the tobacco that were being produced by African Americans and now in African American communities was shipped to the markets in Europe and in England, and the damage that was done in the United States is suffering by people who were transported from Africa. We're seeing I see similar patterns with that. How about you, Larry?
Well, we've always been exploited, I guess is the term you're looking for. And I guess the question I'd ask her is how corporations in Britain and in England, how they're responding to this. Are they responding in a positive way? Are they responding in a negative way? Are they supporting climate change, or are they understanding or accepting the reality of climate change?
It's a good question. I think on the face of it, a lot of the corporations in the UK have started accepting the realities of climate change, and we see a lot of sort of big corporations suddenly rebranding themselves as very environmentally conscious and that sort of thing. For Drax themselves, because the way that woody biomass is classified, it's classified as a renewable form of energy. So their whole branding of Drax is around the fact that they are solving climate change. They're this renewable company, green energy, they're going to be the future, that sort of thing. And we see that sort of day in, day out here in Yorkshire and around the UK. And that's very heavily supported by government policy as well that classifies it as renewable. It means that we don't have to count any of the emissions from the wood that they're burning. So even though woody biomass emits more carbon than coal, it's counted as carbon neutral, with the idea that apparently America will count these stats. So it's being counted somewhere, but that never quite works out in reality. So I think it is starting to change a little bit, the perception of biomass here in the UK. There's been some sort of, over the past few weeks in particular, sort of a range of Conservative MPs, as well as Labour, Greens and SNPs coming out and saying, actually, this doesn't make any sense that we're burning this and we're doing this. But Drax has a very, very good PR team and a very strong lobbyist team. So we know they're having constant meetings with the government, and they're constantly trying to push this image of themselves as being green, clean. They're going to solve it. And I think a lot of sort of the UK government's strategy as well around climate change relies very heavily on counting this as carbon neutral, and in the next stage of what they're pushing to do, to present themselves as carbon negative by capturing the carbon on this end. So, and that features incredibly heavily in all the different government policies around climate change and the 2050 net zero deadline and that sort of thing. So it's sort of a constant work here to try and make people understand how bad this form of energy is and that it's not renewable. And I think that's starting to change a bit, but it's something that we've just sort of got to keep hammering away at, because it's, yeah, they've done a very good job of promoting themselves as this green company for a very long time.
And the thing is, I remember when President Obama did his clean power plan, 2014, and which wound up getting challenged by the Republicans in Congress and others, and eventually was defeated by the courts, and primarily because President Obama was advocating for each state to come up with a implementation plan on how to reduce carbon by 40% by 2030, which we're not going to get to now. And I clearly remember the messaging around biomass, wood pellet, and gas pipelines was that these were these were transitory, temporary solutions to our energy crisis and our climate change crisis. And they were basically saying that the fossil fuel companies, the Dukes, the electric companies, couldn't switch to solar and wind quick enough. So they were saying, we're emitting less carbon and we'll just be there until we can make a complete transition to, the clean renewable energy. But obviously that messaging has changed now. And now they're saying as you said, that they are the future, right?
Mm.
Well, the question, I guess, just to follow up on that question, I read or I watched a documentary recently where the shift from Paris and from the wine regions of Paris to has shifted to Great Britain. And so climate change has had a tremendous effect on the continent itself in terms of changing them. Now the best wines in the world are not coming from Paris, but now they're coming from Great Britain. Has that kind of been an eye opener for you, for the people in your community to see that kind of climate change, that it's affecting you in a positive way, but it's still a very, very strong climate change?
I think yes and no. Like, I think we've had, like last year or every year for the past few years, we've had the hottest weather ever. Like, we were in the 40 degrees last year, which for England, for Yorkshire, is just completely unheard of. And then we come into winter and we have these extreme cold snaps, and we've had record-breaking storms every few months and that sort of thing. And like, yeah, as you say, like with the climate changing and just being hotter on average, the things that people can grow changing, and also lots of crop failures as well because of all the droughts, particularly last year and the years before that as well. There's been a lot of crop failures and farmers finding it much harder. So in a way, I think people are becoming more aware of the tangible realities of climate change. But I think it's also that happens for a couple of weeks. The media sort of puts up a big thing like, hottest summer ever, everyone goes to the beach, and then everyone goes to the beach, and then we all kind of just go back to our daily lives. So I think there is like a growing awareness and a growing sort of realization that there are going to be impacts here, and like we have a lot of coastal communities and that sort of things. We're just a tiny little island, really. But at the same time, I think there's so many other things going on with like the cost of living crisis here and all that sort of thing, that people are just really trying to get through the day and pay their bills and are constantly choosing between things like eating and heating their homes, that it's sort of, it can get a little bit to the side. Like, I think people are aware of it, but also we have a government that's refusing to really take any proper action. And said they're giving tax breaks to oil companies, and funding dracs and all this sort of thing. So I think people are aware. Like, I'm spend a lot of time around environmentalists, so we all spend all our time banging on about it. But I think a lot of people are really just trying to get through the day, and they want climate action to happen, but they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to be going out and demanding that constantly, just because they're trying to, survive.
Yeah, and I laughed a little bit because it's the same thing here on our side of the ocean, or as you say in England, on our side of the pond. I listened to the weather this morning, and they were saying that, sometime next week it's going to go up to 83 degrees in February. And instead of the weather channel, the weather people start talking about climate change and, shifts in weather patterns, etc. They said exactly what you said. Oh, the weather will be great. You can go to the beach, so that's a part of the problem. And then also on our side of the ocean, people are struggling to pay their bills. We have inflation, etc. And when they hear us talking about trying to reduce emissions that are contributing to climate change by 2050, people are more concerned with, how do I survive today? And that's a huge challenge on our end. But it seems, and Larry, you're in the media. It just seems like the media really isn't change. They really aren't sharing a lot of information around climate change.
Well, first of all, the media responds to corporate America. And corporate America, since corporate America, and not only does the media respond to corporate America, government responds to corporate America. And so because both of those two entities respond to corporate America, there's not going to be a lot in the media about climate change in a negative way, because that's not advantageous to selling advertising. That's not advertising. It's not advantageous to selling soap. And so what we've got is we've got the big three. We've got United States, China, and we've got Russia in a space race. And while people like working class people like us are trying to figure out how to make it from day to day, they are trying to figure out how to colonize Mars. They're trying to figure out how when all of this gets so bad that I can't tolerate it anymore, I'm going to move to Mars. And there are already programs in place through Elon Musk and through some of the other people to basically start to work on that. First of all, colonizing the moon and then colonizing Mars. So people have been known, and corporations have done that, and I think individuals do it as well, is they put profits before people. And that's what has gotten us to where we are today, is putting profits above people. And when your kids and my kids can't breathe, or my grandkids and your kids can't breathe because the air is not breathable, or they can't drink the water because they don't have control of the supply of the water, those people who have the means won't be here to fight for that, won't be here doing that. A classic example, you made the comparison to Britain and to the health issues that are related to having an environment where you're having smokestacks, basically. And the reality of that is that when you look at Georgetown, South Carolina has, I think, the third highest respiratory disease rate in the country. And that's one of those conversations you don't have. That's one of those conversations you don't hear anybody talking about, not just in South Carolina, but on the national level. There are more kids that are going to the hospital, my understanding, in Georgetown County because of respiratory problems than there are almost anywhere in the country. And you asked about the cancer rate. The cancer rate in Georgetown is basically through the roof. And that's because there's a wood processing plant in Georgetown. International Paper has a wood plant processing plant in Georgetown County. And so when you have that type of experience, you're going to see, when I look at Georgetown, South Carolina, for instance, Georgetown, South Carolina has an ideal option to be a tourist attraction if they would just move the wood plant out of there. But they won't. And it's not that it creates that many jobs. Then they did the same thing with the steel plant. It's not that it creates that many jobs. It's that politicians are afraid to lose any jobs. You and I were on a call a few weeks ago where we were talking about raising taxes, and the politicians said, "Oh, I can't do that because I lose my job." And so we find people who are not interested in change, not because change is needed or not because change is necessary, but because change is not convenient to their agenda.
Absolutely.
100%.
And while we were in London, we got to meet with Lord Randall in Parliament, who's a part of the House of Lords, and he's interested in that. But again, we also had a demonstration in front of the business energy. Hope I get it right. The business energy and investment strategy department. I know I got that wrong, but they're the ones the tax dollars of people in the United Kingdom are actually being used to subsidize drugs. Isn't that right, Mary? They could not even be in business. So it's the people's tax dollars that are subsidizing an industry that is making people ill on both sides of the ocean. So again, it's politicians, elected officials have they have some responsibility when it comes to these decisions.
Well, their responsibility is now to just get reelected. As long as I'm getting reelected, change can come gradual, change can come slow. And we're seeing that in South Carolina, we're seeing that on a national level, and we're seeing that on an international level. I mean, what part of what we borrowed as a conservative country in the last 6 or 8 years, we borrowed from Great Britain. And I mean, a lot of what Trump's strategy was basically from the leadership in Great Britain. And it's being exported not just to the United States, but across the world.
Absolutely. So Mary, are people aware that their tax dollars are subsidizing industry that couldn't stand on its own? And in the United States, for our listeners here in South Carolina and in the United States, because so many trees are being cut down for the wood product industry, including Drax, this is why you see deer all over the place. This is why, it's someone I know looked out their window in Dillon County and saw a pack of coyotes in their backyard. This is disrupting our environment, which includes our forests, and animals no longer have those safe places to be, so we're starting to see them more and more in residential areas, and so it's impacting human beings, communities, etc. Mary, I had a question because I know, is it true that the employees of Drax went on strike?
Yeah, they're
And
currently, well, they had their first strike day Monday. Apparently I couldn't make it there, but there was apparently really good turnout, and contract workers also striking in solidarity with them as well, which was really good to see. And then I think they've got something like 17 or so more strike dates planned over the coming months. So they're striking both over pay and conditions. So they went on strike a little while ago as well, and there was some interviews with workers there who were saying they're working in like 50-degree centigrade heat, and sort of just awful conditions in there. And they're also not getting paid anymore. So Drax's financial results are actually due out tomorrow morning for us. And I'm hearing rumors that that'll be the first year they've made over £1 billion, including the subsidies, of which previously they've been getting 2 million a day in subsidies coming out of our bills. And so I think, like, it just exemplifies how this company operates, right? They present this very like green friendly image to the public. They're giving out seeds to kids and that sort of thing to go and plant trees in the most ironic way possible. But then they can't pay their workers, they're poisoning their workers are in horrible conditions, they're poisoning communities abroad, they're cutting down forests abroad. In Canada and British Columbia, they're logging on unceded indigenous land. Look at Estonia, highly biodiverse forests. Here for you in the southeastern US, like logging biodiverse forests, reducing flood defenses. I think as a company, it is just such a core example of sort of green capitalism or green colonialism, where they do it all in the name of renewable energy. But wherever you look along the supply chain, they're treating people horribly, they're harming the environment. And so, full solidarity with the Drax striking workers. At the least they could do is pay them properly and sort of improve those conditions for them working. And it's a cost of living crisis, so like the time to be paying people properly now is now. So I hope their strikes go well. I hope Drax at least starts to pay them a bit better, but fundamentally, it's a company that's looking to extract as much profit as it can wherever it can, whether that's from the public or from private sources.
Did you hear the term, what a term she used, Larry? I never heard that before. Green colonialism. Did you hear that?
Well, it's colonialism wherever you look. And so I guess it's just justifiable that it becomes green colonialism. It's become colonialism for minerals. It's become colonialism for natural resources in Africa. So why not green colonialism? I think that that's a natural evolution. I guess the question I'd ask is, the first question I'd ask is anybody tried to organize this organization in terms of unionizing?
So they do have unions there. I think the main unions Unite, which is a pretty big, like broad union in the UK. So yeah, they are unionized, the workers that are directly employed there, and Unite, like they do a lot of good stuff for protecting their members, but it's also very much just sort of focused on keeping jobs and pay and terms and conditions, which is fair enough. But it would be good if they could move a bit more in the climate direction. So the actual direct employed workers are unionized, but Drax sort of contracts a lot of its workers. So a lot of the workers there aren't employed directly, but employed for different companies, all contracted to do a certain amount of work on the site. And I think that is harder to unionize because they're much more spread out. But they are, or have been at least from Monday, acting in solidarity with the workers and refusing to cross the picket line, which is really good.
Yeah, that was something I remember back in the 1990s. Um, and when I was at AT&T, and I kept noticing that we would get these newsletters and different things from our corporate managers and the executives, and they kept talking about re-engineering the company, re-engineering the company. And I was a trainer. We were going to do some training around it, and so I went to our local library, Larry, here in Florence, and I asked them, I said, did you guys ever heard of anything called re-engineering the company? And they had to look it up, and they said, oh yeah, there's 4 new books here about that. And so I pulled the books out, I went home, started reading them, and basically re-engineering the company was exactly what you're talking about, Mary, and what we're seeing in a lot of businesses where they don't have permanent employees. They have temporary agencies that have contractual employees. And so this allows the companies to not give them benefits. They don't have the same benefits. They often don't get the same pay. And like you said, it's hard to get them unionized because their contracts are not long-term contracts. They may have a contract for a year, a couple of years, that sort of thing, that they always are hoping will be renewed. So you're seeing the same thing there with the workers. It sounds like you were saying that even though there's unions, the contractual employees don't belong to the unions or they don't get the same benefits. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Like the UK, I think probably very similar to the US, has moved very much towards this sort of insecure work, short-term contracts, where if it's all contracted out, they don't have to give holiday pay, sick pay, all that sort of thing, all the things that come with secure long-term employment. And sort of, yeah, we have lots of employment issues in the UK, but is very much moved towards that contracted model with a much smaller amount of long-term regular employees. And yeah,
Mm,
Drax very much gets on board with that as well.
yeah. Another question I have is that, like you said, the employees they're exposed to these fumes, and you said that they're constantly working in 50-degree plus temperatures. So are there some of them, or are you working with any of the employees, the unions? Are there any Drax employees who actually see the damage that's being done and really are more on the side of you and your coalition, but they have to pay the mortgages and they have to feed their families. So, but even though they are working, their their interests, their hearts are really with organizations like yours. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, we see a little bit of that. We mostly see that from ex-employees. I've never met an ex-employee who had a nice thing to say about Drax at all. So we have got a fair amount of contact with them. There's a couple of employees that will occasionally message us stuff anonymously, and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of it's mostly former employees though, because I think people working at Drax, like it is a big employer for the area, and they are very, very reliant on that. Like there will be, multiple people from a family employed by Drax, or they're relying on that income. So I think they're quite have been, at least previously, quite unwilling to engage with us, even if deep down I think they agree. And then often when they stop working for Drax, we'll come over and be like, actually, yeah, completely agree, and they're horrible employers too. I think now with the strikes, there's a bit more of an in. I think it's like a lot of, yeah, it's been difficult to make direct contact with sort of actual employees there, instead of going through the top levels of unions, which there's often a lot of like barriers to doing that. So I think now with the strikes, now you're actually getting to engage with just normal workers. There is becoming more of that, and we've been organizing people going down in strike solidarity as well, just to bring like tea and biscuits and all that sort of thing, because in a very British way, I suppose. But yeah, I think there's like a sort of crack starting to form there, because that is one of the main things we've wanted to do, is build those relationships. There's just been a fair amount of barriers, and I think people are worried about speaking out against them whilst they're current employees, but once they're not, it gets a lot easier. And yeah, I've never heard anyone with anything good to say about Drax as an employer, is what I'll say for that.
I laugh, Larry, because their biscuits aren't the same as our Southern biscuits, you know. uh, yeah, but that's great, and I want to emphasize to our audience again that there are no markets in the United States for wood pellets. So all the profits that are being made by companies like Drax and Enviva, those profits are going to companies that are not American companies. There's no markets. You won't be going into Lowe's or your supermarket finding bags of wood pellet. There's a few people who do it up in like Vermont, New Hampshire for their wood burning stoves, but with all the damage being done to our environment, to the predominantly African American communities where the pellet mills are in the United States before they ship them out, that there's no markets, there's no businesses or anything in the United States that are being created or that exist with this market. All we're getting on our side of the ocean is damage and nothing else. And I have to say that with our travels throughout the United States, and especially in the Southeast, whether we're in Southwest Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina or North Carolina, people have said repeatedly to us in rural areas that the flooding is getting worse as the logging increases in these communities. And so we really need to look at the total picture. But you also mentioned that you had did some other work in some other issue areas. What are some of those?
So I guess a range of things. So yeah, when I was at uni, I did campaigning to get the university to divest from fossil fuels. Because a lot of the unis here, probably the same in America, hold all their sort of like funds in these investment funds that are very invested in fossil fuels. And after a couple of years, finally managed to win that one, and that had been like a long-standing campaign. So it was really nice to have that win. Yeah, then I guess on like more of a local level, I used to be quite involved with Extinction Rebellion, and coordinated one of the local groups. So we did a lot of work around the council and setting targets for net zero for 2030. So that was one of the campaigns I was running through that time, and then moved on to sort of, and was also, yeah, doing more national stuff, focusing at things like the media as well. And like, 'cause we have a very our media is owned by 5 billionaires who control the narrative very strongly, so worked a bit on that. And then also got involved with some sort of anti-arms fair stuff, because we have a very big arms fair that happens every 2 years here. So campaigning against that, and how that ties in with, well, horrors all around the world and climate change and all those sorts of things. Our government is very, very big on producing arms and selling them to oppressive states around the world. Yeah, and then I guess sort of just general campaigning, awareness raising, trying to get people more engaged through quite a few different means. And then yeah, drag stuff sort of took over my life a couple of years ago, and I've spent a lot of time on that.
I guess I'll ask is,
Go ahead, Larry.
how engaged have you been with your local and state and national legislatures on these issues?
So we've been involved with the council. So I live in Yorkshire, so we have like a local council for York, then Selby has a local council, Goole, which is the area surrounding Drax specifically. Then we have a more regional council as well, and things like the Yorkshire and the Humber Climate Change Commission. So, and we also have local MPs. So we've been engaging with our local MPs. That's been sort of one of the things the coalition has been doing, is trying to get more people talking to their local MPs about it. The council, to some degree, but they don't have really that much power, at least for things like Drax here in York. But we have been working with the local Selby council and councillors on there as well, who are becoming more anti-biomass. But Drax does also give quite a lot of money to that council and has very close ties with the MP for the area as well. And then one of the things we've been looking at more recently is the Yorkshire and the Humber Climate Change Commission, which sort of sets out the climate plan for the region. So there's lots of really good people on that board. Drax is also on that board as a climate leader in the area. So we've been trying to petition to get them dismissed from the board. And I think that might have actually happened recently, very quietly. So we're waiting to hear confirmation on that. But really, all of it, because of the way the UK or England is sort of structured, any like real change has to come from Parliament. It has to come from the MPs because it's national policy. So yeah.
So the question is, you seem like when you mentioned all the people that you were really touching base with and reaching out to, Parliament wasn't in that group. Is there a direct link or a direct conversation going on with Parliament or with members of Parliament on this particular issue?
There is, yeah. So we've been reaching out to our local MPs, like members of Parliament, and working with them a bit. And then Cut Carbon Not Forest, the coalition that I think like Dogwood Alliance and Biofuel Watch and lots of others are all part of, have been focusing more on direct relationship with MPs, because they have sort of the resources to do that, and much more of them are London based and able to have different connections through them. What I focus more on is the local engagement and sort of the community organizing. So the Parliament stuff is happening, and we often work, we do work very closely in conjunction trying to make those happen. But it's, to be fair, it's not my area that I mostly focus on. But that work is very much ongoing.
I guess the question, the follow-up question would be, is as a media person, I guess my question would be, has there been any type of media campaign? And understand affordability is a major issue in a media campaign. Can you afford to raise the money to create the awareness, especially when you're fighting major corporations who have kind of bottomless pockets? So the challenge becomes, how do you get your message out? Are you using PSAs in the community, public service announcements? Are you using billboards? Are you using flyers and pamphlets? Are you giving them out at churches and community organizations? What is the actual process that you're using to create awareness of this challenge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think a couple of different means, and there's different groups working on it who are sort of employing different means. So we've, for the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, been doing things like stalls, leafleting, social media is a big one across all of them. I think that's been one of the main forefronts we've been trying this. And then also things like writing to local press, getting people to send letters, because Drax often sponsors stuff in the local press. So then we'll respond and get into that whole long back and forth. And part of like the coalition has been reaching out to different community groups in the area and talking to them more, getting them involved, seeing if they want to join. So we've been doing that with things like trades councils, different environmental groups, health groups, that sort of thing. So that's been sort of the local awareness spreading, and also running different events, different screenings, different ways to bring people in and get them engaged. Then for like more, so then if you have like Axe Drax, the way we focused in there on getting media attention is more through direct action, through disruptive things that make the headlines and make it quite hard for them to ignore you. But that obviously takes a lot of capacity. Then you have also like Biofuel Watch and Cut Carbon Not Forests, who are very good at getting things in the mainstream media through op-eds, comment pieces, doing different forms of investigative journalism as well, like uncovering all the secret lobbying meetings Drax has had with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and with government ministers and that sort of thing, and getting that in the press. I think one of the things we are trying to like focus on now though is doing more local engagement and really building up that presence, not just through national media but through sort of one-to-one engagement and that sort of thing, through, as you said, going to community events, stalls, that sort of thing. But yeah, so there's I guess what I'm trying to say is there's been a range of different ways, but I think we're still trying to figure out the way that works most effectively, at least for this area.
How open has general media been to your message?
I think now more, like definitely over the past few months, a year, there's been like an incredibly noticeable shift in how much media attention biomass, woody biomass and Drax is getting, and pretty much all of it negative. For a long time, it did feel a lot like slamming your head against a wall trying to get anyone to listen or care about this. But I think there has been a big shift in that. Particularly, there was like a national media program, BBC Panorama, did an investigation on Drax that caused like a huge amount of attention, and there've been sort of things going on for a while. So I think for a while it took us doing very like spicy, disruptive stuff, or sort of a really big scandal coming out to get into the media, at least the national media. Whereas now it sort of seems like there's a bad news story about Drax every other day, which is great for us. But also, you know, so it's definitely got a lot easier, but it's still an uphill battle, I think, to get that message out there.
Can Britain afford to supplement this process?
Um,
I mean, all economies across the world are suffering at this particular point. So can Britain afford to supplement something that is not directly benefiting their people?
yes and no. I think, could that money be used for much better things, for investing in things like home insulation, that sort of thing that would have a tangible impact on people's bills, quality of life, and the climate crisis? They could absolutely use that money to do something better. Will they is another question. I think because of how closely linked Drax and that industry is with the government, they're quite keen to keep ploughing ahead, although we are sort of starting to see cracks to show, where like you've got the members of parliament who are currently in power coming out and saying this doesn't make any sense. The former minister for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy was recorded saying literally this doesn't make any sense, who then went on to be chancellor and then had a swift departure from government because this government's a bit questionable in its behavior. But I think more and more Conservative MPs are waking up and realizing it doesn't make any sense to be spending this much money, and there's so many better uses for that money. At the same time, Britain doesn't have a real climate plan. And so if they took away Drax and if they took away bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, I don't think they know how, or at least don't have the ambitious view of how to actually meet their climate targets. So it's I think that's often what gets thrown up, is what do you replace it with? Which obviously there are lots of alternatives, but until they're willing to listen to those, it seems like they're quite keen to keep ploughing ahead with it just because of how entrenched in policy Drax and this sort of, this form of energy is. But I do think that's starting to change. And I think because there's such a huge cost of living crisis, because energy bills are so high, people in parliament are becoming more like, why are we spending 2 million a day on the UK's single largest carbon emitter? It doesn't make any sense. But
yes,
Have you measured the contribution that Drax is making to elected officials?
yeah, so they supply, I think it's 12% of renewable energy and I think 5% of energy on the grid. So it's not, they are, I believe, the biggest power station in the UK. So it's not a small amount to lose. It's perfectly possible, like if you insulated every house in the UK, you would take away the need for that energy.
No,
But they are.
what I asked was basically, are you looking at, are you measuring the contribution of the organization to the politicians themselves?
Oh,
Are,
sorry.
are they financing campaigns? Many of the
You
ministers,
know,
etc. Mhm.
elected officials have a tendency not to vote against people who are making donations to their campaigns.
Sorry, yeah, completely misheard you. Yes, they are financing politicians and political parties. So the local MP Nigel Adams for that area, I think, has received about 62,000 in campaign donations from Drax, or sponsoring him to go to different conferences and that sort of thing. They donate money to both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, which are the two main parties here. Not loads of money, but enough to make it a contribution. I think it was in December, it was exposed 2 weeks ago that Drax has been giving money to the Labour Party, and then they sort of sponsor the different MPs to go on trips to biomass conferences and that sort of thing. We've got someone looking more into research on that area at the moment. And they have quite a big presence at like the party conferences and that sort of thing, running events there on how we're going to achieve net zero. And they also have a very strong team of lobbyists who are having very, very regular meetings with the main departments, which I assume there is some form of money going into that. But it's been quite hard to pick out exactly who's getting what. But yes, they are, is the short answer.
Mhm. Sounds very similar to what we go through here in the United States. You talked about media, and with what's happening on our side of the ocean, we're starting to get more and more media now. So, CNN has covered, they've done some stories on the biomass wood pellet industry. New York Times did a really large piece that was right on the front page of their newspaper as well. So we're starting to get some of the same types of action in here in the U.S. Part we've had what I think it was 5,000 organizations signed a letter that went to Congress, and 700 scientists in the U.S. signed letters that went to Congress that was saying that this industry is more harmful than it is beneficial. And let's talk a little bit about, particularly for members of our audience who aren't familiar with the concept that globally around the world, including the United States, that we're supposed to be working to get to net zero carbon emissions. That's why we're doing electric cars, all of this stuff. That carbon emitted by oil, coal, gas, and other types of fuel emit carbon, and carbon and methane are the two main things that are causing climate change. So you mentioned first, I know first they were saying that we wanted to reduce globally, including United States, our carbon emissions by about 40%. We're not going to hit that target. And then you mentioned, Mary, going net zero by 2050. So for our audience, can you kind of explain what that is, and what the governments around the world are saying we must accomplish? Let me emphasize that we must hit this target, or else climate impacts will be worse. And I'm sure in your country, as here, every day something is happening with our weather. Every day, tornadoes, hurricanes, torrential rains, cold across the northern part, extreme cold, etc. So can you explain to them this whole process of net zero carbon emissions? And then you've also mentioned a couple of times carbon capture and sequestration. And what is this carbon capture thing that all the companies, including Larry Duke here in South Carolina, North Carolina, they're saying that they're going to do carbon capture, that it's not going to go in the air. They've got some miracle machines or something. So anyway, can you give folks a little clarity around that, Mary?
Yeah, I can do my best. So yeah, the figure I mentioned was net zero by 2050, which is the UK's own target for emissions. So the idea is not that there won't be any emissions, but they will balance out between emissions that just you can't avoid. So from steel production, that sort of thing, and then like negative emissions, capturing carbon, sequestration, or sort of planting more trees to absorb the carbon. Eventually, that's supposed to balance out. That strategy that the government has got for that was actually recently ruled unlawful because it was just never going to work. So they're working that out again at the moment. But the idea is that it's not that there won't be any carbon, but it will sort of balance out by 2050 to reach a sort of base level, which we are nowhere close to on target for. And it's just highly, highly unlikely to happen, but that is supposedly the target. Then the other thing I mentioned was carbon capture and storage, which, as Rev Leo said, is one of the things that features incredibly heavily in pretty much all climate change legislation around the world, from the Paris Agreement to all the different COP 20, however many's, and yeah, pretty much all global climate legislation and national climate legislation, which is the idea that if you put this technology on sites where it's emitting carbon, so things like oil refineries, when you're burning trees on the smokestacks, gas production, all that sort of thing, you'd put this equipment on and it would capture all the carbon that's being emitted, and therefore there wouldn't be any emissions from that, so you could keep doing it. So this is, yeah, the technology that all of these global agreements completely hinge on, and unfortunately this technology also just doesn't really work. There's one operating site with carbon capture and storage, which is Boundary Dam in, I think, Canada. Their carbon capture rate target for a long time was 90%. The closest they ever got, I think, was 67%. And they've actually lowered their target now. No, I think they got, 67% one year, but I think last year it was about 43% of the carbon they actually managed to capture. So when you take that in the look of like in the view of woody biomass, because that's counted as carbon neutral, because the trees are cut down abroad, supposedly will be regrown and reabsorb the carbon from burning them, making it a neutral process eventually. If you capture the carbon emitted from burning them here in the UK, that will create negative emissions, which means you can then sell or trade those emissions with other companies that are high polluters to balance out their emissions effectively, which then leads you to the net zero. This technology doesn't exist anywhere, has never been proven to work, particularly not at scale. It comes with a lot of dangerous elements and chemicals and processes, but also is a core way, at least here in the UK, for wood biomass stations to continue getting subsidies, because their current subsidies, which, as we were saying earlier, is what they completely rely on, are due to run out in 2027. So they're now applying for subsidies for this, which I think for Drax and their bioenergy with carbon capture and storage plant is estimated to cost £31.7 billion, which is just an astronomically high amount of money for technology that simply doesn't work. But nonetheless, they're reliant on it for their business model, and the UK government was reliant on that in the hope that it will work so that they can balance out the figures and reach net zero.
Reverend, we're down to our last couple of minutes. If you have a statement you want to make, or if she has a statement she want to make, this is about the time to make that statement.
I just was going to add on that carbon capture and sequestration is a technology that's untested and unproven. But like in your country, the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act and some other budgeting, billions of dollars will be going to utilities and other companies to try this untested technology out. And scientists have said repeatedly, the best things that we have on this planet is what God gave us. Trees capture more carbon than anything else. And so that's my little closing remark. Do you have one, Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we already have technology that absorbs carbon. They're called trees, and we're cutting them down and burning them. But yeah, I guess my closing remark is, well, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. It's really an honor to be here. And this needs fighting on both sides of the pond, as it were. We need people in the southern east US fighting it, and we need people here in the UK fighting it and acting together to stop the harm that's being caused abroad, but is being funded by my government, by my country. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope we can do more stuff in solidarity. And if anyone has any questions or anything, we're on social media, SBT Coalition, across all the channels, so you can find us there, or Stop Burning Trees Coalition at Gmail.
Okay. Thank you. And if you want to reach out to me, you can contact us by going to info@newalphacdc.com or going to our website, www.newalphacdc.com, or you can call us at the church where I pastor, 843-799-0740. And you, Larry?
You can reach me at DBS Communications. My website is www.scvillagevoices. I'm sorry, scvillage-voices.com. You can reach me at 843-667-1818. That is our office phone number. We publish 3 newspapers across the state of South Carolina, and we welcome the opportunity to hear from our community about this important issue.
Okay, thank you so much. And so I'll close out with the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as we've seen on the show. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our committed listeners. And until next week, this time, we'll see you again, or you'll hear us again on the Leo and Larry show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.